So, hi everybody and welcome. Thanks so much for joining here. You're here at the Product Expert Fireside Series. My name is Janna Bastow. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ProdPad, and we're joined by Tim Herbig. He's a product expert who's going to be talking with us today. Now, before I give the full intro to Tim, I want to tell you a little bit about this webinar and a little bit about us, and then we'll jump in and talk about product. So this is a series of webinars that we run here at ProdPad. It's a series that we've run for a number of years now. So we've got a number of past talks that have been recorded. You can find that on our YouTube channel or on our site. They've always been recorded. It's a mixture of presentations from some of our experts as well as firesides like you're going to be getting here today. And it's always a focus on excellent insights from experts who are out there, working with clients, working with product teams out there in the real world. And it's a focus on the content and the learning and the sharing. So you're going to be getting a lot of that here today. And today is going to be recorded and shared with you, and you will have a chance to ask questions. So by all means, as you have questions today, drop them into the Q&A panel and vote on other people's questions as well. And that way we can help see which ones are the most popular questions and prioritize those. And a little bit about ProdPad before we get started as well. This is a tool that was built by myself and our co-founder Simon when we were product managers ourselves. We needed tools to do our own jobs. We needed something to help keep track of all the experiments we were running to try to hit the business objectives and to solve all of our customers' problems, and basically to keep tabs on all the ideas and all the customer feedback that made up our product backlogs. And so building ProdPad gave us the control and transparency that we needed. And it wasn't long before we started sharing it with other product people around us. And so today it's used by thousands of teams around the world. Now, it's a free tool to try, so you can jump in and give it a try. It's even got a sandbox mode where it has example product management data. So you can see how things like lean product roadmaps, the OKRs, experiments, ideas, all that stuff fits together in a product management space. And our team is made up of product people. So we love hearing your feedback. We love hearing what's working, what's not working. So jump in today, start a trial, and then get in touch and let us know your feedback. We're always listening. So today is going to be about how to set effective and outcome-led OKRs, right? So I know we talk a lot about OKRs, but we're really going to dive into how to do them properly and what works in the real world. And so we've brought in a particular product expert that I refer to a lot here at ProdPad. He's written some really great articles, some of which I'll share with you today because I do find them so useful, such useful pieces that you can refer to get examples of good OKRs and reference points. I know Tim through Mind the Product, funny enough. Tim's been a regular contributor and speaker on the scene there. And I believe we first met when we spoke, when you spoke at the Mind the Product Hamburg a few years ago.
Right. Coming full circle. Yeah.
You were speaking about leading agile teams effectively, I think, right. Back then. Yeah.
That's correct. Well, that must have been 2018, 2017, 2018, something.
That would have been 2018. Yeah. We're actually both going to be speaking at MTP Engage Hamburg this year. Tim as a workshop facilitator, myself as one of the speakers. So Tim, I look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah. And so for more than 10 years, Tim has worked in various in-house and consulting roles as a product manager and head of product. He's worked in a wide range of industries like publishing, professional networking, and building enterprise-level SaaS applications. And as Tim says, he's on a mission to help product teams find their path to focus on outcomes by connecting the dots of strategy, goals, and discovery. So I'm really excited to have you here with us today, Tim. Everyone, please give Tim a really warm welcome. Welcome, Tim Herbig.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Yeah, thanks so much for being here today. Now, I love your mission statement of helping product teams focus on outcomes. I think it's really driven and also really important. So what was the path that led you to realize that this is a real problem to solve?
I think I would say the key addition to this statement is that I realized that there's a lot of talk in our industry about the ideal state product teams should be in. We all know and probably love the the perfect world scenario of being like a power team that's fully equipped to solely focus on outcomes and like has all the autonomy and all the alignment to do that. But what I found both through my in-house roles, also for my consulting practice, was that there are many, many teams who are not in this ideal place right now, who would love to go there, but simply have no idea of how to go from the feature factory-ish environment they're in right now to this more aspirational environment. And so I think many teams are pretty discouraged by some of the ideal pictures we create in our industry. And so I thought, I was like, I'd like to meet teams where they are, whatever that is, and figure out, so what are the next first steps you can take to at least move closer, right? And don't try to make a change overnight, but move closer step by step to being more outcome oriented. And do that bit by bit, and whatever the environment creates and allows for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I speak to so many teams and so many product people who are trying to be more agile, trying to be more lean. And every time I speak to them, they're almost apologetic that they're not more lean than they are. And they have this assumption that everyone is more lean and more agile than they are because everything they read is from thought leaders and people who sort of made it already or are talking about the fact that they are talking like they have made it already.
Right.
And the reality is when you actually look at the practices of the average company, they're not more lean, right? Most of these companies are actually doing on average just fine compared to the others. And sometimes it takes a little bit of encouragement to get them to talk about how they're working and say, actually, you're doing pretty well. You're taking steps towards it. And the fact that you're here listening to talks like this or talking to people like me or checking out tools like this is actually a step in the right direction, right? You're iterating towards the right processes. You're thinking about becoming outcome led, which is a lot better than you were maybe 2 years ago.
Exactly. And I think it's about this. I think I like to frame this as being aware of the consequences of your choices for product teams, meaning you might have to make the choice to work with, let's say, non-ideal OKRs or non-ideal discovery processes. But as long as you're not sugarcoating it as this is as the best, as good as it gets, it's like, no, that's the point we're at right now. We're trying to improve that. Then I think it's totally fine, right? To know, be aware of the consequences of your current actions and then figure out how to iterate it to improve yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And so, one of the articles of yours that I share most often is, I'm always talking to people about their OKRs and how they can improve their OKRs, and it's this concept of the using leading and lagging indicators. So I'm going to post this one in the chat because I think it's sort of essential reading, and maybe others have actually come across this one before. I'm going to actually make sure I post this to everyone, not just to hosts and panelists. There we go. But I find this one to be absolutely essential reading because, I mean, I've been caught out by this as well. When you first published this, I was like, oh my God, we've got lagging indicators in our OKRs. So what's the difference between a leading and a lagging indicator? I know you're talking about outcomes or objectives.
I think I would summarize the key differentiator, aside from the, let's say, technical definitions. I would like to summarize the key difference between the leading and the lagging indicator in terms of the actual usefulness from a product team's perspective. Because one of the key traits of OKRs, ideally, is that they help you to figure out whether you're on track or not. And if the actions you're prioritizing help you to make progress toward a goal. But what if the cadence at which your goals change just by the nature of your company, your business, your product is so slow that no matter what you do, you will never be able to detect progress within, let's say, typical 3-month OKR cycles for product team. And so I figured that those typical lagging indicators, those more like company level business health indicators, or like things that really require lots of different teams and efforts to come together to be moved at all, are great for this kind of like annual OKR semi-strategic perspective to figure out how does the success of our strategy look like mid to long term. But again, when you're a product team and like quite literally you're sitting in your sprint planning and you seek any kind of anchor to look toward for prioritizing what you're going to work on next, you need a metric that responds to your actions as much as possible. And of course, there is a fine line, as we probably get into, between like being too leading, right? Just like focus on things you can totally control, which are really very superficial then. So it's this striking the balance between not having a lagging indicator, yet something that's still a meaningful expression of whether you are on your path to create the ultimate success for your users and the business.
Right. Okay. And so it kind of comes down to whether you've got enough time within the cadence to actually make a difference with something.
Right. And I think,
And
yeah. And
how
this
much
is like
impact you make.
super, right. Sorry. Yeah. I just want to add one more thing because I think it's like the thing to keep in mind, those for product teams, is that what exactly makes a leading and lagging indicator totally depends on your product and the way it's set up, right? So because from a pure technical perspective, many teams would argue, for example, NPS, for all its flaws, but let's say NPS might be a nice leading indicator because it might help you to predict churn, for example, right?
Right.
Because you could argue detractors are more likely to churn, so it might be a leading indicator for that. I would argue, again, my key criteria for figuring out a leading indicator is like the usefulness or the technical correctness, so to speak. And so I would argue, okay, so how often is NPS measured? Some companies measure NPS once a year. And then I would argue, well, then it's not a leading indicator anymore because no matter what you do within an OKR cycle, the NPS won't change because it's measured. Either you're looking at the score from last year or it's coming up in 3 months. So I think it's important to figure out. So if a metric is leading or lagging depends on how it's measured and how it exists, how it lives in your company.
Right. Okay. So you can change a leading or a lagging indicator into a more leading one by decreasing the feedback cycle, the cycles between how often you actually measure it.
Right. This might be one way. And I think the other practice I like to use is basically very simple, like reverse customer journey mapping, right? So it's like, so what is the lagging event we're looking for? Maybe it's like, maybe it is the reduction in churn, right? Maybe this is the lagging event because that's what the company cares about on the highest level. And what you have to figure out is, so if I want to reduce churn, what are the common patterns amongst segments who are less or more likely to churn? And figure out, okay, what do people who are less likely to churn have in common? And maybe there's a certain number, maybe in the case of ProdPad, it's a certain number of roadmap items created. It's a certain number of ideas collected in the backlog or something like that. And you could pinpoint it to these patterns. And then you would be like, okay, so maybe churn is still a long way out. But if we get to getting people to, I don't know, create 20 roadmap items in the first 90 days of using the product, we are confident that this will reduce the likelihood of churn.
Right. Yeah. And so each product is going to have their own set of different indicators because each product is going to be unique in their in what their sort of key objects are, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think this reverse engineering exercise or idea I just mentioned, the beauty of it is when you do it, it exposes like so many things, the gap in customer knowledge, right? Because people typically customer journey mapping is done with like post-its in a siloed wall. People are like, yeah, that's what's happening one step after another. But then you're like, okay, can you show me the data that proves that this is what's actually happening? And like, no, we just assume that's the logical order of how you would do it. Like, well, okay. And so that's of course the thing, like this identifying leading indicators by reverse customer journey mapping only works if these are proven patterns that are happening, contributing to that.
Right. Okay. So how does somebody actually do this reverse customer journey mapping? I mean, is it just a customer journey mapping exercise where you're looking at it from a different angle, the same sort of people involved? Like, how do you do this exercise?
I mean, so the way I like to introduce it is when I work with a team, particularly on the midst of, so we're maybe I'm either looking at a completed OKR set or we're discussing the usefulness of the key results in an OKR definition workshop. And so we might arrive through some guiding questions like, hey, tell me, how often does this metric change? Or how equipped are you to influence this metric? And then it might turn out, well, this is actually quite a lagging indicator. And so like, okay, cool, let's try to figure out what is a more leading indicator from that. And so we put the lagging indicator up on the wall at the right or wherever. And then I would ask the question of like, okay, which actions would we have to do our customers do more of or less of in some cases to drive this lagging event? Or which behaviors do we as a team or stakeholders or internal departments have to engage in more or less? So these would be some prompting questions in general. Okay, so we know like if customers create more idea backlogs, if customers add more things to the shopping basket per session, this increases the, I don't know, conversion rate, churn, or average revenue per customer.
Okay, that's fascinating. And any sort of gotchas that people should watch out for as they're doing this? Any sort of common things that
Yeah,
people run into?
I think the most important thing is like while this reverse engineering might give you a nice a nice like range of options to choose from, I would, and this creates like a bit of a scale of like going from lagging to leading. I would caution everybody to not go for the most leading one on the very left, so to speak, because this might be one of those very leading but potentially superficial metrics. So understand that not just because a metric is leading, it's automatically a great key result, because some of these might be too superficial and not meaningful enough. So look at the range of options you have created from this exercise and figure out, okay, so going through some sanity checks, basically, well, which of these can we actually measure should be a good starting point, and which of these are still like, like not lagging, but like meaningful directions. And then probably one or two or three from this exercise might help you enhance your key results and make them more useful.
Right. Yep. And I've just noticed that Lawrence has just pitched something into the chat here, and it just went to the host. So I'll share it here with everybody else because I think it's worth sharing. He said it's worth noting that a lagging indicator can be converted to a leading indicator simply by targeting specific segments that are deemed to be most impacted. And he shared an article here by Gibson Biddle. He said reverse story mapping can lead to proxy metrics that can inform leading indicators. So I'll share that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that that's a useful a resource, and comment on what you're talking about as well.
Definitely.
Excellent. So what are some of the things that you see teams struggle with when they're trying to determine good outcomes?
That's a really good question. I think I would probably boil it down to two. There's probably more, but I would say there's probably two key elements I'm on the lookout for. One being, how clear is the clarity of the strategic choices you're trying to make? As in, are you just repurposing an outcome or like a rather generic key result just because it works, it's there, it's nice, it looks good? So how explicit is this choice of the metric you're trying to chase, right? I think this is an important bit. And again, this highly correlates to the product strategy clarity, right? So have you articulated, it's like this common mix-up between goals and strategies. Like goals are not per se strategy. Just because it's a goal doesn't give you strategic guidance. Goals can be an important part of strategy, but like on their own, they're really good expression of strategic choices. So this strategic clarity. And the second bit is actually it sounds obvious, but it isn't to many teams, which is that when you talk about an outcome, and if we try to take a step back and like, so what is an outcome? I love to go back to our science definition, like you saying the outcome is the change in human behavior. And if you take that to heart, it's like, so it's the change of human behavior. Yet if a product team who is tasked to change the behavior of humans, whether that's buyers, user segments, stakeholders, internal teams, has never interacted through qualitative, quantitative measures with these humans, how would they be able to articulate the change in behavior they're trying to create? So I'm saying you cannot ask teams to define, leave alone work on changes in actual behaviors if they never understood the current behaviors in the first place, aka did any kind of discovery or research work. I think that's something that's oftentimes forgotten because it might be easy to write down and buy the book outcome, but it's a completely different beast if to figure out if it's actually rooted in real problems and real behaviors that exist in the target market you're trying to serve.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're right. I don't think a lot of people think about it that way. And Meredith asked a question. Again, this one went to the host and panelist chat. If you could, put your questions in the Q&A, and that makes it a little bit easier to manage these, especially as everyone's going to start getting the questions in soon. Could you elaborate on how you'd identify an indicator that's too superficial versus one that's a useful leading indicator?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to a lot of what you could probably call product sense and experience. I think honestly, I would argue that most product teams can tell when a leading indicator is too superficial when they see it, right? I think you can see that. I like to use a graphic which tries to tie leading and lagging indicators to those other terms like outcomes, outputs, and stuff like that. At the very end of the scale, like the most leading events you can probably come up with if you repeat this exercise are what you could call the inputs. So just the number of hours the team puts into a certain effort is of course super leading because you can influence it directly, it changes at a high pace. Yep. Yet it conflates or it confuses. I would say as you go from lagging to leading, you're trading definitive causation for responsive correlation. I think I got that right. The thing is, like, if you move too much to the left, like it's pure correlation and accidents, basically. So you don't want to like just work on that. So again, I think it's no, like, I'd like to stay away from real frameworks. I think it's most product teams know like a metric, like number of hours spent on X might work for some teams, right? For some use cases, this might be a leading indicator that helps you to stay on track. For others, it's just like, well, whether we spend the time or not doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's similar to measuring the success of your users as well. Like if your users spend a number of hours in your app, like is that a good thing, or does it just mean that your app is so frustrating they can't do their jobs without spending hours and hours and hours in it, right? It can be really difficult to pin down the exact thing that indicates success, and you've really sometimes got to do that that first and second order thinking to really think about what success means to people. And it often is, some other more distanced action or task or something that's completed that isn't an hour or a minute or a time-based thing that's spent on it. It's not something you can just immediately do. It's not something you can just, lob more hours into or more tasks at. It's something you can influence rather.
Exactly. I think this comes down to this whole idea of, like, again, the idea of the user understanding, because number of hours spent in the product is something typically the business wants the users to do.
Right.
It's not something the user wants to do per se, right? It might be the result of the solving the actual task they came here to do. This might lead to a certain number of hours spent in the tool, but they're not logging in like, oh, I guess I love to spend 8 hours a day in Google Analytics today. And that's not the motivation, right? Which again comes back to this idea of, like, have you understood the context, motivation, and problem of the core user segments?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's that could actually take me down some interesting paths around, dark OKRs, or bad OKRs, right? Setting OKRs that might lead you down the path of saying, well, actually, we want people to spend this many hours on things versus, perhaps some unethical OKRs that might be get people to become more addicted to products than they should do, or encourage teams to ask their users to take the wrong actions or take actions that they probably wouldn't have done in order to get them to, hit goals like we're going to get the right page views or get enough ad impressions or whatever else.
Right. And I think that's interesting framing, because one conversation I have with some companies, when I try to get them to like basically recognize some of the discovery gaps they might be having, when we're trying to talk through things like, okay, what's the highest level business metric, might be something like a conversion rate in e-commerce example, right? And then I ask them, look, so what's the outcome you're trying to drive for this particular user segment? Let's say new users on iOS or something. Like, they want to drive the change in behavior of putting more things in the basket. It's like, yes, that is a change in behavior that ticks the box, yet it's what you want them to do. It's not what they, meaning the users, want to do. So the key question, the rephrasing would be, have you understood why they are not putting more things in the basket? I totally accept that that's what you want them to do from a business perspective, yet something is probably, if the rate or metric or whatever is super low, like there has to be something in the way of them doing that. And so it's your job to figure out what's in their way, and solving this problem, this is the actual outcome you should be driving, not the outcome from the business perspective. So it's like basically like the business intent versus the actual user outcome.
Yeah. Any tips for product managers who need to drive the business in a perhaps more ethical, user-centric way, rather than being driven by more commercial business needs that may impact the user's user or health needs?
And I think that's that's a tricky topic, right? Because I think for me, I'm all for acknowledging certain business interests sitting at like a very high cascade or pyramid of metrics, right? Because after all, I mean, you have the job because some kind of business metrics work out, right? I think it's important to not fool yourself. I think it's the same reason that you don't want to engage in solving user problems for the sake of solving user problems, right? So I think you should be, should be able to tie your efforts into something larger. And so one exercise I like to do is that like to make that more transparent, because teams struggle on this outcome solution level and those overarching business goals, is that like to use something like impact mapping, which has been around for quite a while, to try to boil things down from like, okay, so what's the business impact, the business metric, and then again using this explicit articulation of what is the change in behavior for the users that's rooted in a proven problem, and use that as the exact, like that's the framing for articulating the outcome. And this framing alone like basically reduces the wiggle room to sneak in things like add more things to the cart, because we're like, that's again, and I think that's the issue with being too much focused on by the book advice and just sticking to the rigid template, because this is a change in behavior, right? You could argue like this is an outcome. It's like you could just argue, well, it's a potentially misguided outcome because it's not rooted in a real understanding of what has to happen to make users successful, as you put it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is important to make sure that the decisions that are made at the product level are driven by what's important to the business and not driven by cheap tricks, not driven by quick wins. They're driven by what's important to the business, and what's important to the business should be what's important to the user. If the business knows what's good for it generally.
Right. I think that there is probably a line where you like something like conversion rate to drive a funnel, right? Like clearly matters more to the user, to the customer, to the business. Sorry, clearly matters more to the business than to the user.
Yeah.
Yet, if you're able to treat the problem that's happening along the funnel as like the proxy to drive the conversion rate, you're solving a real problem, hopefully, to contribute to those business needs. So I think it's like seeing. I like to just like frame like solving user problems is like some kind of a proxy activity for making sure you're contributing to the right business metrics or priorities.
Exactly that. And that's one of the things that I like about OKRs is that they cascade down, right? Like the objectives that you're working on at the user level should all feed into overarching business objectives. And you should be able to justify what you're working on based on what's important to the business.
Ideally, you are there. That's true.
Ideally, it should all fit together. But yeah. Now, are these outcome-led OKRs for everyone? Are they the only way? Or do you have any advice for companies who are sort of on the journey towards becoming outcome-led?
So I think that it's important, just with so many things we do in product, is like, I think being aware of like, look, is there a real understanding and a genuine articulated intent at the company of like, why do you want to start focusing on outcomes? Like, is it just like because that's on vogue, that's what product people do. It's like, have you understood like the actual benefit it can create for you? Because I believe, and one of the benefits could be that this leads to more empowered teams and shifting the decisions about solutions from C-level to product management team level, potentially, right? And the question is like, are the people who commit to, let's try to focus on outcomes, are they aware of these consequences? Which comes back to that. What are the consequences of your actions? Like, what do you mean by outcome-oriented means the product teams decide the solutions? That's not what I had in mind. I wanted to have outcome OKRs. So I think that's important to be aware of. And so, as I said earlier, I believe that I love to see more teams kickstart their journey toward OKRs and toward outcome OKRs and outcome orientation, instead of getting discouraged by those over-polished and like over-glorified examples that are out there, right? I think you can go to okrexamples.com and see lots of different examples where you have no context at all of where they come from, how useful they are, what product they contribute to. And so I think it's important about figuring out, well, where are we on this journey? Like, where do we want to be? As in, what are some of the benefits we would love to see from using something like OKRs, whether it's increased team autonomy, more focus, better strategy execution, multitude. What are your individual benefits of what you want to get out of OKRs? How would that look like? So like in your mind, articulate like a key result for using OKRs, maybe even like what would change as a result of using OKRs. and then designing the way you use them accordingly. And I think this has to be in line. Like for most obvious example would be, let's say you say one of the main benefits of using OKRs is to empower, like to enable team autonomy. Yet the way you implement OKRs is that C-level passes down the objectives of defines the objectives for the product team. And the product team can only articulate the key results for that. It's like, well, this sort of like contradicts the idea of team autonomy a little bit. So you need to be aware of the way you use OKRs as that matched your intent, what you want to get out of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm going to take some questions from the audience here. Offer, sorry if I've mangled your name here, said, should we set or define the leading or lagging indicators before the actual objectives?
No, I don't think so. I mean, no, sorry. Let me rewind. It depends. So let's preface that with that.
Yeah.
I believe that there are multiple ways in how you can approach your OKR definition, right? Obviously, the textbook advice is to go from strategy to objective to key results, and for some teams that works, right? For other teams, specifically, especially for those who might not be as used to outcome thinking and a certain maturity when it comes to using OKRs, it can be difficult to get started with this qualitative intent in the form of the objective, right? Because that's a little bit artsy, right? To create this statement, that's a little bit. I love it, but it's not for everyone. And so for those teams, it might be more practical to start from the key result level, to brainstorm the key results first, then to spot the patterns amongst the key results and figure out, okay, what's the pattern, what's the theme, and then create the objective that can be the inspiring headline for this theme. So I think there are multiple ways in how you can approach the OKR definition. You can start from the objective, you can start from the key results. Some teams even honestly have to start from the tasks because they're not even thinking metrics. So I have them line up the outputs and the projects they are supposed to work on and trying to reverse engineer key results from those committed projects. Right. So, and then go to objectives. So trying back to this question, it depends on how your OKR approach looks like. I think having a general understanding of the leading indicators that drive your lagging indicators is a good input for OKR definition in general, because it probably enhances the key results pool you're able to draw from. Yet, I think it's totally fine if it's like a follow-up discussion, as in, look, we have like 3 key results on the wall for this objective. Let's do a brief sanity check on them, on like outcome, output, leading, lagging. It turns out, well, 2 of these are really lagging. So let's try to reverse engineer some leading indicators for these 2 specifically to make them more useful if possible.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And so Darcy asked, should key results be measurable, or can they include actions to be completed, like shipping features or launch campaign or hire person, etc.?
Right. I think again, it comes down to this idea of like, what are the consequences of your actions? So technically, you can design the key results with task descriptions and things to be done. Point is, like, what's the consequence of that? The consequence is that you're pretty much replicating a product backlog, which begs the question, why do we have OKRs next to a product backlog? So again, a key benefit for OKRs can be that you think more about what you want to achieve compared to what you want to do, because by then looking at the metric, it's easier to use this common, like, how might we framing, and say, like, how might we key result, which probably leads to a couple of different solutions you could pursue then. So this is very generalized. Again, for some teams, for some activities, for some products, those output-ish, feature-y key results can work for structuring your progress. Again, they come with certain downsides, as in you're skipping the conversation of what's the best possible solution, because you assume what's the best possible solution. So can be not recommend, as in it probably doesn't help you with this outcome orientation. But again, if that's your starting point, as long as you're aware of that you have to change aspects to make these more outcome oriented, that's your starting point, and be mindful about iterating.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love that phrasing of how might we? It's a question that we use a lot here in ProdPad. And, I used a lot in my day-to-day vernacular, because it opens it up. It sort of allows you to suppose instead of assert, right? It allows you to sort of pull in collective knowledge around how you might solve problems. And, when it comes to setting OKRs or, any sort of list of tasks or, whatever is coming up, and you're trying to say, do this or do that or do the other, you're basically setting scope at that point in time. And
Right.
with key results, it's sort of got this implied fixed time, because
Yeah.
OKRs typically have a time component as well. So if you're
Right.
fixing time and scope, then the only thing that's got to give is either cost or quality, right? And cost
Exactly.
usually can't give because your team is a
Yeah.
fixed cost, and therefore quality has to give. And I
Yeah.
always say to people, like, it's okay to pull that every once in a while. Like if something
Yeah.
does need to be done by a particular time, and you're willing to let something else give in order to make that thing
Exactly.
happen. Like deadlines happen. We don't live in La La Land.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to give up on something, right? Something else is going to get pushed, or you're going to have to give up on quality for that. But if you continuously use that tactic and say, well, I'm just going to make a big task list and tell everybody to go do this, this, and this, and put all of our
Yeah.
tasks either in a timeline roadmap or in a list of key results, you're going to end
Yeah.
up with a whole bunch of stuff which is low quality. And this is where tech debt comes from. This is where stressed out teams come from. So,
Exactly.
as one-offs, it's fine. But if you overuse it, you will just find that the team just becomes exhausted and you don't end up delivering all the stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this, like, I love to use the Hermite reframing as well, like as like a very high level sanity check of, are you talking about an outcome or are you already talking about an output, right? Because it's so obvious. It's like, imagine you're invited to an ideation session, and there are two groups you could join, and each group has a how might we statement on their door, and one group says, how might we build the share button? You're like, well, that doesn't sound fun. I'm not going to join this discussion. The other one says, how might we enable easier sharing of data for account managers? So like, that sounds like a challenge. And so you could think of it this way, like product teams seeing a how might we statement which says how might we build the button. It's like, well, guess it's the question of blue or green, but it's the as you said, the scope is pretty much fixed.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're basically setting the outcome as this really, really fixed thing. You're saying, well, the outcome is to do the thing. You're like, well, actually, if I set the outcome as a wider set of things, then we could actually find a wider range of ways to solve that same outcome and actually do it in less time or more time, but better. And it allows the team to use their collective knowledge and abilities to do it. And if you give them that flexibility over a wide range of tasks, they'll actually outperform a team who's just given a fixed set of tasks and just told to go do stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, really good questions. Thanks for that, Darcy. And I tried to answer a few of those all in one there. Right. Helen says you touched on understanding what motivates users of the product. There are many customer persona templates out there in terms of setting effective OKRs. What elements of customer persona would you say are essential to address?
So I mean, I think that probably lots of different interpretations of what exactly is a persona, and I'm not trying to engage in all of these. I'm just going to generalize and say I'm not the biggest fan of a persona, for the reason being that very often this is a fairly static representation of a user group, and it oftentimes does not really consider the context you're interested in. So what I like to do instead is, again, I like to use this concept from the impact mapping idea I mentioned earlier, which is that figure out like what's the broad strategic direction you're trying to go into, right? Is this like churn, internationalization, market expansion, product quality, satisfaction, whatever it is, and then figure out, look, what is the most meaningful segmentation amongst our users in regards to that strategic goal. So I like to categorize user segments, and as a cascading consequence, the metrics of their success always in the context of the strategic goal. So for example, if the broader strategic goal is to drive NPS, I would form user segments along the lines of the NPS score and figure out, is there a common denominator across, like, oh, it's always the iOS users who are least satisfied. So probably one segment is iOS users who are detractors. So this might be a segment, right? Because all the other persona fluff, I would say, is not relevant to that context. You would try to recruit people based on this attribute of iOS users who gave a low NPS score. Or if you're trying to drive monetization, you would probably segment your users along the lines of their the premium membership or the average money spent per quarter or per cycle, whatever it is. So coming back to that, maybe you could like work your way around making personas work, but I'm rather looking into segmentation in the context of the strategic goal you're trying to contribute to. And you mentioned the idea of the need, the motivation, and this taps a little bit to this broad idea of like jobs-oriented research without going into the trends of jobs to be done details. I'm not here for that, but the fundamental idea of understanding people don't just use the product because they love to spend so much time there, but because it's simply the best option to solve a certain problem, and to figure out what is the actual job people are trying to accomplish by using a product would be the research lens I would try to use here.
Excellent. All right, that's a really good insight. And on that lens, you were just talking about the research side. So Henry asked in the chat, he said, what do you think about setting OKRs when in a very early discovery phase, like this defining user problems prior to building anything?
That's a really, really good one. I'm trying to parallel because I recently wrote a newsletter on this, and I might be able to share that because it's such a complex question, to be honest. So the way I like to put it, I think trying to approach it from I don't want to overuse the word like first principle, but like from the lens of what do I want to get out of OKRs? I want to get out of OKRs some kind of quantified progress that I can use to figure out whether I am on track or not. And I think the issue might be that if you would just use the traditional outcome OKR of how the final change user behavior might look like, this might be an issue for discovery work because the change in behavior will only occur once you ship something. So for all the time before that, problem understanding, solution ideation, prototyping, testing, releasing, iterating, measuring, basically your key metric will change, right? Which contradicts the key idea of an OKR being useful. Having said that, I realized that there is a bit of a blurry area of how to do that. But I think I would summarize it. There are two types of metrics you could use, or key results you could use to structure this phase of working. The one being a little bit more output oriented on purpose, right? Again, you're trading a lot of causation here. You're saying like, look, what are the traits of effective, successful discovery? It might be things like number of first-hand customer interactions per week. It might be number of or share of participants from other departments in ideation sessions. It might be things like discovery check-ins, attendees by executives or something like that. These metrics might help you to figure out whether you're executing product discovery to the best of your abilities, right? So it's a little bit more of a process-oriented metric, which again, doesn't guarantee a great product ultimately, but it's something you can influence, which changes along the way, which you could use to structure your discovery. The even better, even more useful metric would be metrics that signal you changes in behavior in the discovery phase. Now, what do I mean by that? By that, I mean things like, instead of setting the number of like, we want to do that many usability tests per week, maybe you say, we aim for a specific task completion success rate in the usability test, right? So we're trying to drive the outcome of successfully completing the prototype task. Mm-hmm. Potentially, you're using a metric like maybe you're doing lots of Wizard of Oz MVPs or fake door tests through email. So you're aiming for open and click-through rates potentially. Or you unsubscribe rates from emails where you test something, or opt-in rates into new beta product announcements. So these things are more outcomes, again, which are not the final user outcome you're looking to drive, but which help you to figure out whether you're on track or not. I just found this newsletter. I'm just going to drop it in here, if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah. Drop that newsletter in, and we'll share that with everybody afterwards. Yeah. So we've got a copy of that.
I have to turn it into a proper article at one time, but that's the mess that I have that around. Sorry, my email tool looks horrible, but yeah.
No, that's great. That's great. You're sharing so many great insights here. And so, actually, when we talked previously, you shared insights about clients of yours who shared concerns about OKRs not really fitting in with the way that they work, it being an additional process, an extra layer of work, not one that always made sense in the context of their day-to-day work that included things like handling bugs and support and discovery and other stuff. So how can OKRs be brought in as like an integral part of their business's work rather than an extraneous set of tasks and meetings and the OKR stuff that happens over there once a quarter and then work over here?
That's a good example. Like my favorite example for that being a customer was like, look, we work with a traditional OKR consultancy to introduce OKRs to the company, and like they provided us with a list of meetings and routines we'd have to do. When we were asked them if we could skipped the OKR check-in because we were asking pretty much the same questions in the sprint planning. They were like, no. It's like, but why though? Because if you really like boil it down, like the OKR check-in is about, well, have we made progress toward our goals? If yes, cool. What are we going to continue doing to make progress? If we don't make progress, what else are we going to do to make progress? Which is pretty much the conversation that you ideally have in your sprint planning, right? Well, what's the overarching goal? What are we going to do in the next sprint to contribute to that? And so that's my favorite example of saying like, well, integrate the OKR check-in in your sprint planning, because that's the discussion you're having, the looking ahead and selecting priorities based on your goal progress. Or you could do it with the sprint review, where you not just talk about the things you have created, but also the things you have achieved. So we did that many story points, velocity, burn down. We all know these nice Scrum vanity metrics talking about sprint performance, but you could complement these with like, here's how our goals have changed in the last couple of cycles. And so I think the key idea being though, which has to be answered before that, is what do we want to cover through OKRs as a product team, right? Because as we talked at length throughout this the session so far, OKRs might not work for every type of work, for every type of product, for every type of business, right? Because it doesn't make sense to just replicate generic KPIs in a different format and to just replicate your product backlog. So figuring out, well, what are the parts of our work as a product team that we can like translate into into meaningful OKRs, that might differ. For some teams, it might just be the internal way of working. So you're only covering 10 to 20% of your capacity. For some, it might be just the day-to-day business, or it might be anything in between. I think the biggest mistake, though, I would argue, is that for product teams trying to cover 100% of their capacity through OKRs, because that assumes that they are able to predict everything that's going to happen in the quarter, right? And I think that's the you should always have some kind of capacity not covered through OKRs on purpose, like regular maintenance, bug fixing, ad hoc requests, supporting tasks with other teams, right? I think this should be, and I think you brought up a great example in our conversation of like, it's fine to not cover something like tech maintenance or tech debt through an OKR if it's just the regular things you're doing. But if you're looking back at the last quarter and the main thing that was keeping you from achieving your other OKRs was the amount of tech debt and the instability of the platform, then you would want to make this an explicit new OKR for the coming cycle to invest in reducing tech debt. So I think that's a great way to think about it. If it's like something where you want to react to new requests, to new bugs, whatever, that's fine to keeping on the track side and not covering it through OKRs. If it's a new, specific, explicit, proactive priority you want to cover, make it an OKR.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you actually had a really great analogy that I loved, which was the car analogy for
yeah.
OKRs. Yeah. Do you want to talk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously the joke is that as a German, you have to have a car analogy, even if you don't have a car. So it's like, and even if it's like electricity and stuff like that. So the idea being that most like generic high level company OKRs can be compared to car fuel, as in it is important. Like revenue is important, it matters, but you're not trying to change it day in and day out with everything you do, because it's just something you start to care about once it dips, typically below, when it dips below a certain threshold, right? Simple car fuel is like, cool, it's there, might be very expensive, but it's there. But I'm only going to care about the next gas station once it dips below 20% or something. Whereas continuing the car analogy, key results should be more like something like, what's the explicit choice you're making about your car trip? You're not making the explicit choice to tank gas, because you have to do that. So that's not a choice, it's a given. The explicit choice might be things like, well, which route are we going to take? Are we going to drive more on the highway or smaller streets? Or how much money are we going to spend on snacks? How many stops are we going to do? This is like the more explicit choice you might be making about this car trip compared to whether you put fuel in the car or not.
Yeah. All right. That's a great analogy. I really appreciate that. And thanks so much for sharing. I think we've got time for a couple more quick questions.
Yeah.
Is it advisable to align non-product teams to work towards OKRs if their impact on the key results are significant, and how?
Oh, that's a good question. So
essentially, good question.
What I'm hearing is like non-product teams. Yeah, non-product teams using OKRs, right? It's essentially the gist of it. It's what I'm hearing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So many depends there. I think the thing is that typically it's for product teams, it's a little bit easier to adopt that because they're used to certain fundamental patterns of OKR setting. And again, I think it depends on how does the business of this non-product department look like? How does their product, so to speak? And I would consider, for example, if you're in accounting, the annual budgeting sheet is kind of your product that you're trying to own, a company's budget. So again, what are the attributes of the product equivalent you're owning, and like, can you actually drive it, or are you someone who's really like reactive to it, right? So for example, with accounting, I would argue like, well, you probably can't change things like the amount of spending in the company or what money is spent on, because you're not the one spending it. The things you might be able to shape, which goes back to this idea of using OKRs for changing the way you work, would be a certain quality standard for receipts ensuring a certain quality standards for receipts submitted, or a certain response time to support inquiries about how to invoice certain things. So again, these are the things that you can influence. So if you want to explicitly tackle these things, I think OKRs can work really, really well. Trying to boil down like product-oriented company OKRs to non-product departments typically is quite difficult, I have to say.
Right. And Nayara asked specifically, how can the customer success managers contribute with the product team for setting more effective OKRs?
That's awesome. I think my favorite world would be that customer success is a part of a cross-functional product team. I think this would be the best way, because this way, when OKRs are designed, customer success is in the room for committing to that's the change we want to create, that's the goal, that's the key result, and because we're part of the team, we have the capabilities to deliver on this success. So I think this would be ideal, assuming like a company structure. So being part of that conversation, I think at least customer success can be an amazing source of information for things like the leading lagging indicator discussion. So trying to do this reverse engineering from lagging to leading, customer success probably has some really, really good insights of what are the actual steps that are happening along this journey toward the lagging indicator. I think that can be great. And of course, if you try to tackle explicit satisfaction metrics for users, customer success probably is in there for like measuring it and making sure like what makes people unhappy, or potentially you, as a product team, you're trying to solve a problem not just for the users but for the customer success team. So maybe you realize the customer success team is the most important user segment for driving a specific business goal because it takes them so long to respond to a certain thing or whatever, and maybe it's worth solving a problem for them.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's really, really good insight, and we've done a really great run around of understanding in depth how to set OKRs, effective OKRs for to get teams to be more outcome led. Somebody actually gave some feedback here. He sent it to us privately. He said it was great, nuanced insights on over discussed topics. A lot of people talk about OKRs. There's a lot of info in there. But Tim, you give some of the top content out there on it.
Awesome.
If you really dive into actual examples of it, which I really appreciate. So there's you've posted one of your newsletters up here. I've posted one of your articles from before up there. Everyone who's been listening in, you will get a copy of this recording shared with you. You're also going to get a follow-up email with some of our top Tim links in there as well. So I've got some favorite articles that we'll share with you. So keep an eye out for that. You'll be getting that probably next week, because I'm not sure if you know, but it's a very short week here in the UK. God save the Queen. And so I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your weeks. And I want to say, Tim, thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you all for your questions. It's been wonderful having you here, and see you back here next time for our product experts fireside. And thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed that. Thanks,
yeah, of course.
Janna. Thanks to the audience for all the great questions.
Yeah, of course. And see you in Hamburg.
Yeah, see you in Hamburg.
All right. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.